Tom McCready was 40 years old, and he'd built his life on a foundation of silence and solitude. 40 years of Texas sun beating down on his face, 40 years of watching the seasons turn over the same dusty patch of land his father had worked, and his father before him. He lived by a simple code, a code carved into him by a lifetime of isolation. You don't invite trouble in, and you sure as hell don't go looking for it. But on a Tuesday so hot the lizards were hiding in the shadows of rocks, trouble didn't bother to knock. It came stumbling right up to his fence line. He saw it from the top of the windmill, where he was mending a busted vane. A horse, a fine-looking bay, moving with a strange, jerky gait. Then its legs buckled, just gave out. The rider, a woman in a fancy city dress, now torn and covered in dust, was thrown forward. She didn't scream. She didn't even try to break her fall. She hit the baked Texas earth like a sack of feed dropped from a wagon. One moment, she was there. The next, she was gone. A crumpled heap of fabric and stillness. Tom scrambled down the ladder, his heart pounding a rhythm that felt foreign in his chest. By the time he reached the fence, the horse was on its side, its breath coming in ragged, wheezing gas. Foam, thick and white, flecked its mouth. Tom had seen it before. Poison. This was no accident. The woman lay completely still. He knelt beside her, his rough hands hesitating for a moment before he gently turned her over. Her face was pale beneath a layer of dirt, but even then, he could see she was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a storm cloud on the horizon. Papers in her saddlebag identified her as Victoria Sterling, from Chicago. But papers could be bought. Papers could lie. And Tom McCready hadn't trusted a piece of paper in 15 long years. He couldn't have known as he lifted her surprisingly light body into his arms that he wasn't just carrying a stranger into his home. He was carrying the match that was about to set his entire, carefully constructed world on fire. He was carrying a reckoning. A man can live 40 years thinking he understands the world, thinking he knows the difference between right and wrong, between safety and danger. But what he was about to learn was that true danger doesn't ride in with guns blazing. It wakes up in your bed, looks at you with haunted green eyes, and smiles. She woke up with a sharp, ragged gasp that sliced through the quiet of the cabin. Tom was at the stove, the coffee pot halfway to his cup. For 36 hours, the only sound in the small space had been the soft, rhythmic whisper of her breathing. He'd gotten used to it. The sudden, violent absence of that sound made his own breath catch in his throat. "Easy," he said, his voice coming out like gravel poured over sandpaper. He didn't turn around. "You're safe." He heard the rustle of the blanket as she sat up. He kept his eyes locked on the curling steam from the coffee, focusing on it like it was the most important thing in the world. "Where am I?" Her voice was smooth, cultured, the sound of money in big cities. But underneath it, there was a tremor, a tightly coiled spring of fear. "Broken Creek Ranch, Texas," he said, his hands surprisingly steady as he poured 2 cups. "Found you by my fence line. Your horse. It didn't make it." The silence that followed stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, he risked a glance over his shoulder. She was taking in every detail of his small Spartan cabin. The single bed, the rough-hewn table, the stone fireplace. Her eyes weren't just looking. They were assessing, calculating, like an animal in a trap, figuring out the angles. Her gaze fell on the clean bandage on her forehead, then drifted down to the simple cotton shirt she was wearing. His shirt, her expensive city dress, torn and filthy, was nowhere in sight. "You took care of me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. And he couldn't tell if she was grateful or accusing. Heat crawled up the back of his neck. "You had a fever. Had to get you out of those wet clothes." He turned back to the stove. "I only did what was necessary." The look she gave him then was strange. He could feel it on his back, a mix of relief and something else, something sharp and analytical. "You're not what I expected," she said, his shoulders tensed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Most men—" She let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. The shirt was long on her, but not that long. He caught a flash of pale thigh before he spun back around, his knuckles white on the counter. You really don't know, do you? She asked, her voice softer now, laced with a strange kind of pity. Know what? He gritted his teeth, angry at himself. Angry at her for making him feel like a clumsy boy. She was quiet for so long he finally had to turn and face her. She sat there, poised and elegant even in her disheveled state, watching him with an unnerving intensity. How old are you, Mr. McCready? 40, he admitted. The word felt like a confession. And you've lived here alone all that time? Since my mother passed, 5 years now. Her lips parted slightly, a small, perfect O of surprise. Tom found his eyes drawn to them before he could stop himself. A jolt of pure, unadulterated want hitting him so hard it almost buckled his knees. He looked away, his face burning with a shame so deep it felt like it was scorching him from the inside out. Mr. McCready, she said, her voice careful, precise. Tom, have you ever been with a woman? The coffee cup slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the wooden floor and shattered, the dark liquid spreading like a stain. He dropped to his knees, grateful for an excuse not to meet her eyes, fumbling with the broken pieces of ceramic. He couldn't get the words out. Oh, you poor man, she whispered. The pity in her voice was like a physical blow. It made him flinch. I managed just fine, he mumbled to the floorboards. I'm sure you do, she said. He heard her stand up, the soft sound of her bare feet on the wood. But managing and living, they're two very different things. She moved toward him with a grace that was almost predatory. He scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the rough wood of the wall, the shards of the broken cup forgotten. What are you doing? He asked, his voice tight. She knelt in front of him, so close he could smell the clean scent of her skin, mixed with the soap he'd used to clean the dust from her face. It was intoxicating. It made his head spin. You saved my life, Tom, she said, her green eyes locking onto his. The least I can do is thank you properly. I don't need any thanks. Her smile was soft and devastatingly dangerous. Oh, I think you do, she whispered. I think you need to be taught a few things. Starting with lesson 1. Her hand came up and her fingers gently, deliberately, touched his cheek. His entire body went rigid. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run. But he was pinned to the wall, not by her strength, but by a sudden, terrifying hunger he had spent 40 years pretending didn't exist. And in that moment, Tom McCready knew his quiet, lonely life was officially over. Lesson 1, Victoria said, her voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate right through him, is eye contact. Tom stared at a knot in the wooden floorboards, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to spring. I don't need any lessons from you. Look at me, Tom. It was a command, soft but unbreakable. He fought it. He really did. He tried to focus on the spreading coffee stain, on the dust motes dancing in the morning light, on anything but her, but it was like fighting gravity. Slowly, reluctantly, he lifted his head. Her eyes were incredible, a deep forest green, flecked with gold. But they were also reading him, dissecting him, peeling back the layers he'd spent a lifetime building. His gaze flickered down, involuntarily, to where his shirt gaped open at her throat, to the hint of the curve of her breast. A wave of hot shame washed over him, and he jerked his eyes to the ceiling. Stop that, she said, her voice sharp. Stop what? He mumbled, his face burning. Looking at me like you're committing a mortal sin. She leaned in closer, and the scent of her, clean and slightly floral, filled his senses. Desire isn't a sin, Tom. It's human. My mother said, your mother is dead. The words were brutal. They hit him with the force of a physical slap. He flinched, the old grief and guilt twisting in his gut. Victoria's expression softened instantly. The hardness in her eyes melted away, replaced by a genuine flicker of regret. I'm sorry. That was cruel. But she's gone. And you're still here. Still alive. Don't you want to know what that feels like? To really live? Over the next 3 days, she became his teacher, but her lessons had nothing to do with the physical act he both craved and feared. She taught him the things his overbearing mother and his own crippling shyness never had. She taught him how to hold a conversation without staring at his own boots. She taught him how to listen, not just to words, but to the spaces between them. She'd sit across the small table from him, her borrowed shirt a stark white against her dark hair, and she would just, talk. About the theater in Chicago, about books he'd never heard of, about the politics of a world that felt a million miles away. And she made him talk, too, pulling stories from him about his childhood, about the ranch, about the quiet loneliness of his life. He was a quick study. On the fourth morning, he handed her a cup of coffee, and for the first time, their fingers didn't accidentally brush. He'd finally learned to control the tremor in his hands, the desperate little current of electricity that shot through him at her slightest touch. "You're learning," she said, her lips curving into a small, approving smile. She took a sip of coffee, her eyes watching him over the rim of the cup. "But you're still holding back." Tom sat down, the worn wood of the chair familiar beneath him. The morning light caught in her hair, turning it into a cascade of silk. "Holding back from what?" "From asking the questions you're dying to ask." A prickle of unease ran down his spine. "I don't know what you mean." She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, the movement pulling the fabric of his shirt tight across her chest. Tom's knuckles went white where he gripped his own cup. "You want to know who I am, Tom," she said softly. "Why a woman in a silk dress ends up half dead in the middle of nowhere. Texas. You want to know who I was running from." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "Are you still running?" "I figured it was a man," he said, his voice low. Her smile vanished. A shadow passed over her face, so dark and cold it chilled the air in the cabin. "It's always a man, isn't it? In this case, my brother, Marcus." She told him a story then, a sordid tale of high-stakes finance and betrayal in the smoke-filled back rooms of Chicago. Of her brother using her beauty and charm as bait to lure in wealthy investors for his fraudulent schemes. She painted a picture of a gilded cage, of a life of luxury that was nothing more than a prison. "Everything's falling apart," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The investors are getting wise. And Marcus, he needs a scapegoat. He needs me to disappear. Permanently." Tom's blood ran cold. "He wants to kill you." "Oh, he'll get around to that," she said with a bitter laugh that held no humor. "First, he needs to destroy my reputation. He'll tell everyone I was the mastermind, the seductress who stole their money and broke their hearts." She looked him straight in the eye. "The irony is, I wouldn't know the first thing about seducing a man if my life depended on it." Tom carefully set his cup down on the table. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. "I find that very hard to believe." Her head tilted, a curious glint in her green eyes. "Do you? What would you do, Tom, if I tried to seduce you? Right here, right now?" The question landed between them like a lit stick of dynamite. His pulse hammered in his ears, so loud he was sure she could hear it. His mouth went dry. "I'd probably make a fool of myself," he stammered out. "Probably," she agreed, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She rose from her chair and began to move around the table, a slow, deliberate circle that felt like it was tightening around his chest. "But that's not what I asked." She stopped right beside his chair. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body. He didn't dare look up. Her hand came to rest on his shoulder. Her fingers were light, but he felt their touch like a brand through the thick cotton of his shirt. They traced the line of muscle there, a slow, exploratory touch that sent a shiver down his spine. "I asked what you would do," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Not how you'd feel about it." He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could feel was the searing heat of her hand on his shoulder and the wild, frantic beating of his own heart. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. The rhythmic, unmistakable beat of approaching hooves. The moment shattered. Tom was on his feet in an instant, the spell broken. He moved with a speed and purpose that seemed to come from nowhere, grabbing the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. Victoria stared at him, her hands still frozen in the air, where his shoulder had been. "Get down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. Through the cabin's single window, he saw them. 4 riders moving at a slow, deliberate pace, They weren't cowboys. They were dressed in dark coats, their hats pulled low. They moved with the cold efficiency of predators closing in on their prey. "It's them," Victoria whispered from behind the heavy oak table, her face a mask of pale terror. "The one on the black horse. That's Marcus." Tom squinted, his eyes narrowing. The lead rider sat his horse with an easy arrogance. A man who had never been told no in his life. Soft hands, expensive clothes. The kind of man who paid other men to do his killing for him. The rider stopped 100 feet from the cabin, close enough to talk, but just out of easy rifle range. "Victoria, darling. Maxudri." Marcus Sterling's voice rang out, smooth as silk and cold as a grave. "Come on out. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Tom moved to the side of the window, making sure the long barrel of his rifle was visible. "You're not welcome here. Ride on." Marcus let out a short, condescending laugh. "And who are you? The local hero?" "Just some lonely rancher who got lucky when my poor, confused sister showed up on his doorstep. She's good at that, you know, making simple men feel important, right before she empties their pockets and breaks their hearts." "That's not true," Victoria hissed from her hiding place. But the poison in Marcus's words had found its mark. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through Tom's resolve. Hadn't she asked about his land? About his livestock? Hadn't he, like a fool, mentioned the old, played-out mine shaft up in the hills, rambling on about how his granddaddy thought there was still a vein of gold in it? "Think about it, cowboy," Marcus shouted, his voice laced with mocking pity. "A beautiful woman, a damsel in distress, appears from nowhere. Suddenly you're her knight in shining armor. How many of your little secrets has she charmed out of you?" Tom's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles were bone white. Every word was a hammer blow, chipping away at the fragile trust he had started to build. "Tom," Victoria's voice was a desperate whisper, "you can't believe him. Please." But how could he not? He was a 40-year-old fool who had never known a woman's touch. He was the perfect mark. "Toss out your weapons," Marcus yelled, "and send my sister out. Do that, and the simple rancher gets to live." One of the other riders shifted in his saddle, and Tom saw the glint of sun on a pistol barrel. They were professionals. They had the cabin surrounded. "How many bullets you got in that rifle, cowboy?" Marcus taunted. "There are 4 of us. We have all day." Victoria crawled over to him, her face inches from his. Her eyes were wide, frantic. "Tom, there's something I didn't tell you about the gold mine." His blood went cold. "What about it?" I sent a telegram to my lawyer in Chicago," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I told him about it. I told him I'd found a rich, secluded mine and a trustworthy partner to help me work it." Her voice cracked. "I thought it would prove I was safe, that I was setting up a new life." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of guilt and terror. "Tom, I think I led them right to you." Outside, Marcus was losing his patience. "Last chance, Victoria. Come out, or we burn the cabin down with your new friend inside." Tom looked from the men outside to the woman beside him, the woman who had turned his world upside down, the woman who had awakened something fierce and protective in him, something he hadn't known he possessed, the woman who might have been playing him for a fool from the very second she opened her eyes. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Victoria met his gaze, and in her green eyes he saw no deception, only a terrifying, desperate sincerity. "Because I'm betting my life that you're the kind of man who protects people," she said, "even when you have every reason not to." And God help him, she was right. It didn't matter if she was a liar. It didn't matter if she was a thief. The thought of letting that slick city bastard outside lay a hand on her made something primal and savage rise up in his chest. He had lived 40 years in the quiet, but the quiet was over. "Get behind the bed," Tom said, his voice flat and hard as iron, "and stay down." He raised the rifle to his shoulder just as the first bullet shattered the window, sending a spray of glass and splinters across the room. The world exploded into a cacophony of gunfire and splintering wood. Tom moved with an economy of motion that was terrifying to behold. He wasn't a clumsy, shy rancher anymore. He was something else, something focused and lethal. He fired, worked the lever action, fired again. Each shot was deliberate, placed with deadly accuracy. He didn't aim to kill, he aimed to intimidate. A bullet kicked up dust by Marcus's horse, making the animal rear and scream. Another shot splintered the saddle horn of a second rider. These weren't scared farmhands, they were hired guns, but they were used to bullying unarmed city folk, not trading lead with a man who seemed to have been born with a rifle in his hands. They hesitated. That was their mistake. In that brief pause, Tom fired twice more. One rider clutched his shoulder, yelling in pain. Another found his hat blown clean off his head. Panic began to set in. This wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. "He's just one man!" Marcus shrieked, but his voice was thin with fear. His men weren't listening. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of dust, leaving their employer sitting there alone. Marcus stared at the cabin, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, but his eyes locked with Tom's down the barrel of the rifle. He saw something in Tom's gaze that froze the words in his throat. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, empty promise. He yanked his horse's reins and fled, disappearing into the dust with his wounded pride. The fight had lasted less than 5 minutes. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before, ringing in Tom's ears. Smoke curled from the barrel of his rifle. Blood trickled from a shallow graze on his temple where a stray bullet had kissed him. Victoria emerged slowly from behind the bed, her eyes wide. She stared at him, not with fear, but with a profound, staggering awe. "You could have died," she whispered. Tom lowered the rifle, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its wake. He looked at her. Really looked at her, not as a mystery or a temptation, but as a person, a terrified, brave woman who had placed her life in his hands. "So could you," he said. She crossed the room, her bare feet crunching on the broken glass that littered the floor. She didn't seem to notice. When she reached him, she stopped, her gaze searching his face. Then she slowly raised her hand and placed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it hammering against his ribs, a wild, powerful rhythm. "The gold mines," she said, her voice quiet. "I did tell my lawyer about it, but not to steal from you." Her fingers traced the worn buttons of his shirt. It was a code, a distress signal. "I told him if he ever received a message about me finding a gold mine, it meant Marcus had found me and I was in immediate danger." Tom stared down at her, the pieces clicking into place. The telegram wasn't a betrayal. It was a cry for help. "But why?" he asked. "Why not just tell me?" "Because I didn't know you, Tom," she said, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "I wake up in a stranger's house, in the middle of nowhere. For all I knew, you were just another man who would try to use me. Or worse, I had to be careful. I had to test you." He thought about her lessons, her probing questions, her strange behavior. It wasn't seduction, it was reconnaissance. She had been mapping the terrain of his character, searching for weakness, for danger. "The mine's been played out for a generation," he said, his voice rough. "Nothing left in it but dust and fool's gold." "Then why did you fight for me?" she whispered. "Why did you risk your life for me?" He looked past her, out the shattered window, at the endless expanse of the Texas prairie. He thought about 40 years of silence, 40 years of hunger he hadn't even known how to name. He thought about the dead look in his own eyes when he caught his reflection. He brought his gaze back to hers. "Because for the first time in a long time," he said, the words feeling strange and true in his mouth, "someone looked at me and saw a man worth saving." A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It wasn't calculated or practiced. It was real, and it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows and letting the light in. "You're wrong, Tom McCready," she said softly. And then she rose on her toes, her hands still pressed against his heart, and she kissed him. It was soft and hesitant at first, a question. Then as he responded, his own hand coming up to cup her face, it deepened. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was something more profound. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of two lonely, shipwrecked souls finding a safe harbor in a storm. It was Tom's first kiss. and it tasted like coming home. But as he held her there, in the wreckage of his cabin, a cold thought snaked its way into his mind. Marcus was gone, but he wasn't dead. Men like him didn't just give up. They didn't just ride away. They regrouped. They brought back armies. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. And they were standing in the middle of the battlefield. A week passed, a strange, surreal week suspended between the violence that had just happened and the violence that was surely coming. Tom boarded up the broken window, swept up the glass, and patched the bullet holes in his walls. Victoria, whose real name he learned was Elena, helped. They moved around each other in a new kind of silence. Not the awkward, tense silence of before, but a comfortable, companionable one. They talked. She told him her real story, not of a scheming brother, but of a cruel, powerful husband she'd been forced to marry to save her family from ruin. Marcus Sterling wasn't her brother. He was her keeper. The embezzlement was real, but she was the one who had discovered it. She'd been gathering evidence, planning to escape and expose him, when one of his spies had caught on. Her desperate flight across the country was not to escape justice, but to deliver it. In turn, Tom found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in 15 years, about the life he'd had before Broken Creek Ranch. He hadn't always been a reclusive rancher. 15 years ago, he'd been Sergeant Thomas McCready of the Texas Rangers. He'd been good at it too. Too good. He'd been investigating a powerful smuggling syndicate run by a wealthy, untouchable family. A family that bought politicians and lawmen like they were cattle. He'd gotten close, too close to bringing them down. So they'd framed him. They'd planted evidence, paid off witnesses, and turned him from a hero into a wanted man. The man on the poster wasn't a murderer. It was him, a ranger accused of killing his own partner. The Sterling family, the very same criminal empire Elena had married into. Their meeting wasn't a coincidence. It was fate, a collision of two lives thrown off course by the same malevolent force. They were two fugitives, hiding from the same monster. "He'll be back, you know," Tom said one evening, as they sat by the fire. "He can't afford to let either of us live. We know too much." Elena nodded, her face grim. "He won't come back with a few hired guns. He'll come back with an army. He'll burn this whole place to the ground to make sure we're silenced." "Then we can't be here when he arrives," Tom said. He saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "So we run? Again?" "No," Tom said, a hard glint in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The look of the Texas Ranger he used to be. "We don't run. We choose the battlefield." He unrolled an old yellowed map on the table. It was a survey of his land, crisscrossed with lines and notations. He pointed to a spot in the hills. "The old mine shaft. You were right about it. It's played out. But my granddaddy didn't just dig for gold. He was a smuggler during the war. The mine isn't just a mine." He looked at her, his expression intense. "It's an entrance to a network of tunnels that run all through these hills. They're a maze, dangerous, unstable. But I know them. I played in them as a boy. Anyone who follows us in there—" He didn't have to finish the sentence. Elena understood. It wasn't an escape route. It was a trap. "How do we lure them in?" she asked. Tom looked at her, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Men like Marcus have two weaknesses, greed and ego. Your telegram already baited the hook with greed, the promise of a rich gold mine. Now, we just need to wound his ego." The next day, a lone rider from a neighboring ranch was paid handsomely to deliver a message to the nearest town's telegraph office. The message was addressed to Marcus Sterling's lawyer in Chicago, but they knew Marcus would have it intercepted. It was short and simple. "Sterling, your wife says to tell you she's found a better partner. The gold is ours. Come and get it if you think you're man enough. T. McCready." It was a taunt, a challenge, a red flag waved in the face of a raging bull. There was no turning back now. They spent the next 2 days preparing. They packed water, food, lanterns, and ammunition. They moved everything of value from the cabin into the tunnels. On the third day, Tom stood at the window, watching the horizon. "They're coming," he said, his voice quiet. Elena came to stand beside him. In the distance, a massive cloud of dust was rising against the setting sun. It wasn't 4 riders this time. It looked like 20. "Are you scared?" she asked. Tom looked down at the woman who had crashed into his life and shattered his solitude. He thought of the lonely man he had been, hiding from ghosts. He was still scared. But for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't scared of dying. He was scared of losing. "No," he said, turning from the window and taking her hand. "Let's go to work." They didn't retreat into the main entrance of the mine. That was the obvious path, the one Marcus would expect. Instead, Tom led Elena to a narrow crevice hidden behind a thicket of mesquite half a mile away. An old air shaft his grandfather had dug. They slipped inside into the cool, damp dark of the earth. The silence of the tunnels was absolute. It pressed in on them, broken only by the drip of water and the sound of their own breathing. Tom lit a lantern, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn rock walls. "Stay close," he whispered. "Some of these passages end in a sheer drop. Others are prone to collapse. Step exactly where I step." They moved deeper into the labyrinth. After about 20 minutes, Tom stopped and held up a hand. He pointed to a small grated opening in the rock above them. Another air shaft. It looked directly out over the main entrance to the mine. They could see them now. Marcus was there, his fine city clothes already covered in a layer of dust. He was flanked by nearly 24 grim-faced men, all heavily armed. They approached the mine entrance cautiously, their guns drawn. "See?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing slightly from the mouth of the cave. "I told you the fool would hide in here. He thinks he's clever." One of the men peered into the darkness. "It could be a trap, boss." "It's a hole in the ground, you idiot," Marcus sneered. "He's trapped himself. We don't even have to go in after them. We'll smoke them out. Or better yet," a cruel smile spread across his face, "we bury them." He turned to 2 of his men who were unloading heavy wooden crates from a pack mule. "Dynamite!" Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They weren't going to follow them. They were going to seal the entrance, entombing them in the mountain. "He's smarter than I thought," Tom breathed, his mind racing. Their clever trap had just turned against them. They were the ones who were caught. But then he looked at Elena. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw a spark of defiance. She wasn't broken. She wasn't beaten. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and in that moment a new plan, a desperate, insane plan, began to form in Tom's mind. "He thinks this is the only way in or out," Tom whispered, his eyes gleaming in the lantern light. "He's wrong." He grabbed her hand and pulled her away from the air shaft, plunging them back into the oppressive darkness of the tunnels. "There's another way, an old prospector's route my granddaddy used to use. It's dangerous. It hasn't been used in 50 years. But it comes out high on the ridge, behind them." It was a race against the fuse. They scrambled through the tunnels, Tom moving with an instinct born from childhood memory. The air grew stale, thick with the dust of ages. Twice they had to crawl on their hands and knees through passages so narrow they scraped their shoulders on the rock. The tunnel groaned and creaked around them, loose pebbles skittering down from the ceiling. It was a tomb, and it felt like it was trying to close in on them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom stopped. Ahead was a wall of rock and dirt, a dead end. "I don't understand," Elena panted, her voice tight with rising panic. "Tom, I can hear them outside. They're setting the charges." "It's not a dead end," Tom said, running his hands over the rock face. "It's a collapse, but it's old. Loose." He braced his shoulders against the wall of rubble. "Help me." Together they pushed. At first, nothing happened. The rock was unmovable. Despair began to creep in. Then, with a low groan, a few stones shifted. They pushed again, frantically digging with their bare hands, their nails splitting and bleeding. Dirt and rock cascaded down, but they could feel it giving way. A sliver of moonlight pierced the darkness. With one final desperate shove, the blockage gave way, and they spilled out into the cool night air, gasping and covered in dirt. They were on a high ledge overlooking the entrance to the mine. Below them, Marcus and his men were clustered together, their backs to the ridge, watching the entrance with gleeful anticipation as one man prepared to light the fuse. They hadn't been heard. Tom looked at Elena. He held up 3 fingers, then slowly counted down. 2. 1. He let out a piercing whistle. Down below, the men looked up, their faces a comical mixture of confusion and shock. They saw the 2 figures silhouetted against the moon on the ridge above. It was impossible. How? Marcus started to say, but he never finished. Because that's when Tom opened fire. He wasn't aiming for the men. He was aiming for the crates. The open crates of dynamite. The first bullet struck sparks off a pickaxe lying beside the crates. The second hit one of the wooden boxes, splintering it. The hired guns, realizing what he was doing, began to panic. They scattered, firing wildly up at the ridge, their bullets pinging harmlessly off the rocks around Tom and Elena. Then came the third shot. It hit its mark, a single stick of dynamite that had rolled out of the broken crate. The world turned into a white-hot flash and a deafening roar. The explosion was immense, far bigger than anything Marcus had intended. The chain reaction ripped through the other crates, a series of concussive blasts that echoed through the canyon like the wrath of God. The shock wave threw Tom and Elena back against the rock wall, knocking the wind out of them. When the dust began to settle, the scene below was one of utter devastation. The entrance to the mine was gone, replaced by a mountain of rubble. Most of the hired guns were either dead or had fled into the night. But one figure was staggering out of the dust cloud, clutching his arm, his fine clothes in tatters. Marcus Sterling. He saw them. His face, illuminated by the flickering flames of the burning scrub brush, was a twisted mask of pure hatred. He drew his pistol and fired, the shot going wide. Tom raised his rifle, taking careful aim. It was over. He could end it right here. End the man who had ruined his life, who had terrorized the woman he was coming to. He stopped the thought. He could end it all. But as he looked down the barrel, he didn't see a monster. He just saw a pathetic, beaten man. Killing him now wouldn't be justice. It would be an execution. And he wasn't an executioner. He was a Texas Ranger. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle. He never saw the movement from beside him. Elena, her face set like stone, had pulled the small Derringer pistol from a hidden pocket in her skirt, the gun she'd had with her all along. She fired a single shot. It wasn't a killing shot. The bullet hit Marcus in the leg. He screamed and collapsed to the ground, clutching his shattered knee. Elena stood there, the small gun smoking in her hand, her eyes blazing with a fire Tom had never seen before. That, she said, her voice shaking but clear, is for everything. Weeks later, the dust had truly settled. With Marcus Sterling in custody, his story, combined with the evidence Elena had painstakingly collected, was enough to bring the entire Sterling criminal empire crashing down. The investigation reopened old cases, including that of a framed Texas Ranger. Tom McCready's name was officially cleared. A delegation of Rangers came out to the ranch. They offered him his badge back, a full reinstatement with honors. Tom looked at the small, silver star resting in the captain's palm. 15 years ago, he would have given his life for it. He politely refused. "My life is here now," he said, and for the first time, he knew it was true. That evening, he and Elena stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. "You have a choice to make, too," he said quietly. "Your family's name is cleared. Your inheritance is restored. You can go back to Chicago. Go back to your old life." She was quiet for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. "That wasn't my life," she said finally. "It was a cage. A pretty one, but a cage all the same." She turned to him, her green eyes soft in the twilight. "I've had enough of cages. I think I'd rather see what it's like to live in a place with no fences." He didn't know what to say. The shy, awkward man was still there, right beneath the surface. But this time, he didn't let him win. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers laced with his. "It can get awful quiet out here," he said, his voice a little rough. Elena smiled, a real, brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "I think we've both had enough quiet to last a lifetime." She leaned in and kissed him, and this time, it wasn't a kiss of gratitude or relief. It was a kiss of beginning, a promise of sunrises and shared coffee, of hard work and peaceful nights, a promise of a future. They say the Old West was won with iron and grit, with guns and gold. But sometimes in the quiet corners of that vast and dangerous land, it was saved by something else entirely, by two broken people finding each other in the dust and choosing to build a life together instead of just running from the past. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button for more stories where the greatest treasure isn't buried in a mine, but found in the human heart. And let us know in the comments. What was the biggest twist you didn't see coming? Until next time, keep riding toward your own sunset.